Hi, this is Darren Fredrickson with Team Guardian and creator of the Master Surveillant Training Program, which provides professional surveillance training for public and private investigators. In addition, I'm a board certified protection professional. I've also co-authored 7 books in the police science related fields. Remember to like below if you find value in this content, and I encourage you to subscribe and join me on this crusade to make this a safer society. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to Master Surveillant Mindset here on Northwest Digital News. We have the Master Spy, Darren Fredrickson, there on your left. Coming to us from the Black Room. Kevin Hunter here in the at the broadcast desk, and Kyle Torgerson making all the tech happen here on the show today. Well, we're going to talk about different types of predators, and let's kind of kick this off with the social violence. This is a little different category than like the serial killers and all that. Dive into the social violence a little bit, Darren, and share with us what are kind of the habits of these people and the things that people should be looking out for.
So with social violence, it's not intended to be deadly, but it can become deadly depending on how it escalates. And usually social violence is about ego, it's about dominance, and you usually see it amongst men, especially more commonly amongst younger men, and a lot of times it's over a woman. And it's basically, there's an author, Rory Miller, who basically calls it like the monkey dance, where if you look back at the native, like the monkeys, the chimpanzees and all that, and you see how monkeys are, or even like the rams, where they basically they're contesting for dominance, and it's basically about showing who's the big boss. And so a lot of times these social types of violence occurs at schoolyards with young kids, and especially at like bars and sporting events where you have alcohol and drugs. In the office, it's more like verbal dominance, where it's just comments or statements where there's employees that are trying to get dominant positions and all that, and just be more dominant. So to de-escalate out of these social violence type things, and we're not talking predators here, we're just talking about something that's been going on for thousands of years, where it's just male species trying to be a dominant to show whose status is, to basically check your ego and back out. And the reason you want to do that is if you get involved in the social violence with a fist fight and all that, you can't really claim self-defense, because you basically ended up in this altercation because you didn't back out. And it's hard to do because we're conditioned to be dominant, right, and to show that social status. So it's hard to just basically kind of give up and back out of it. But that's the best thing to do, because otherwise you can get hurt, and or you can get sued, depending on what the result is of that incident.
Well, Darren, I'm glad you mansplained all of that to us. I'm just kidding. Unfortunately, it has something to do with that male dominant thing about just being dominant. I mean, fighting over women, fighting over different status things. It is kind of in the genetic programming for males, isn't it? Absolutely, definitely is. Let's dig into this antisocial violence, which is the second type, and the type that many people are familiar with there, and quite often does turn deadly. Some of the aspects of the antisocial violence, which are the predators.
Yeah, so this is what I dealt with my entire career, are these types of predators. Obviously, I went to my occasional street fight when I was a patrol officer. I've seen plenty of fights during surveillance, but the antisocial violent predator, basically there's 2 types of them. One of them wants something tangible. So that's your mugger, your burglar, your robber. They're looking for a wallet. They're looking for money, a car. They're looking for something tangible. Then you have the other type of predator, which is a lot more fearsome. It's the one that actually wants the act, which the act is violence, rape, murder, and those type of antisocial predators are much more sophisticated. They learn through trial and error, and that's your serial killer and your serial rapist.
So can we jump into it really quickly, because obviously if you're dealing with a predator who's really after possessions, that's a far less dangerous predator than somebody who's after a given act. And so, what would be some clues to you if somebody should encounter one of these predators? What would be some clues that this is really a possession type predator?
So usually their goal is to get whatever that tangible item is. So if it's the purse, if it's the car, if it's the wallet, if it's the credit cards, whatever it might be, just give it to them. To avoid this type of a threat and to avoid harm to yourself, just give them whatever they're looking for, whatever tangible item they're looking for, give it to them, let them go, because that's their objective. And again, 90% of these individuals are your drug addicts, and that's what they're looking for, is drug money. And depending on when they had their last fix of drugs, they may become more risk takers and more violent because they need that money or that tangible item. So once they have that, that's their goal. They're not looking to harm you. As a matter of fact, a lot of these individuals will use intimidation rather than violence, because intimidation works just as well. And a lot of them know the law. If I touch somebody, it becomes a robbery, where if I just ask them, not using a gun, but basically just intimidating them into giving me something, and they provide that, then I reduce my risk of becoming a victim myself, because these offenders will sometimes end up in a violent incident, and then they actually come out on the bottom, and they don't want that. They just want the tangible, and they want to move on. So
speaking of coming out on the bottom, and maybe the predator not picking such a good victim, the story that you shared about the mugger who targeted a 68-year-old guy that he saw limping out of a building and decided he was going to separate him from his cell phone. Tell our viewers about that story.
Yeah, so it came through the news a week or two ago, and it was a mugger who had been casing a parking lot in Florida for a couple hours. They had reviewed video, and like I told you, predators target the weak, the older, easy targets. Well, this guy came out, he was 68 years old, looked like a senior citizen, was limping out of a Mexican restaurant, and got hit in the back of the head by a bottle. So he turned around, and there's this 20-some-year-old young male who basically said, "Give me your effing phone." And this guy happened to be a 5-time world champion kickboxer whose injury was due to a muscle pull because he was training. He's trained to be the oldest living kickboxing champion. And he took it to this 20-year-old and probably broke his ribs. The guy went down, got up, realized this is a bad mistake, and went running off, and they never did figure out who it was, this last I checked. So again, the mugger picked this guy. Not only was the guy coming out of a Mexican restaurant limping, he was wearing a shirt that advertised his gym. He owns a gym for kickboxing, and on the back it said kickboxing gym. So the mugger missed the back of the t-shirt because he hit him from the back. So he obviously must have had access to see his shirt. So he missed that. But also this 68-year-old kickboxer probably wasn't using situational awareness, which maybe he goes and eats there a lot and wasn't just paying attention, got hit in the back of the head. But he taught this guy a lesson. So it goes to show that this is a situation where this predator targeted the wrong person, not knowing that this guy is very, very capable of taking care of himself, and that's what happened. He ended up on the bottom.
Situational awareness, a big thing, even for, in this case of the guy, the kickboxer, paying a little extra attention. Maybe this guy may not have targeted him at all.
Yeah, because he was out there, I guess video showed he was out there loitering around the parking lot for 2 hours looking for a good victim, and he saw this guy limping, and he was older, and he figured this was an easy one. He wanted to just separate him from the herd and take him out. And so these predators use two different strategies, and this would have been a blitz attack. There's two types of attacks. There's blitz, and then there's using charm, right? So blitz is power, speed, and position, using intimidation. And the other type is a charmer, and the charmer is much more long-term focused, where they're looking to basically use social skills to get the victim in a vulnerable position, so then they can use location and control. So they might use a ruse. This is your typical, "Hey, little girl, do you want some candy? Hey, can we go look for my lost dog?" Or an older person saying, "Hey, do you have a cigarette? Do you have the time?" they're looking to engage socially with this person to make them feel comfortable, to use charm, to then basically get them in a vulnerable position where then they can use a blitz strategy where now they have you alone. They're going to blitz attack you, violence, rape, murder, once you're under control. So these are much more longer term focused predators. They're your serial killers, your serial rapists. And the one thing I would stress, and I learned this not only from years of experience in studying this, but working a serial killer that we had in Phoenix that I think killed 10 or 12 women, raped and killed them. And we worked surveillance on that case for, about 6 months, looking at targets, looking at neighborhoods. So we spent quite a few months working that case, but those victims were all carjacked generally at gunpoint. Victim was transported to a secondary location where then they were raped and killed. So you don't ever, if you're kidnapped or somebody's taking you to a secondary location, that is the time you have to escape. Because if you don't escape, your chances of surviving that are pretty slim. Their goal is that predator is going to go through that act. That predator wants that act of violence, rape, murder, and that's what his objective is. And so that's why you have to avoid that secondary location no matter what.
And at the same time, even though their goal is violence, they want to do it with the least amount of risk possible, and that's why they're trying to get you out of wherever you're at.
Sure, and that's if it's an elevator, it's a parking garage, it's a abandoned house, a backyard, anywhere where there's privacy, and they have the location that they feel comfortable. There's no witnesses. And mainly they're looking for privacy so they can carry out their act. It doesn't have to necessarily be transported in a car somewhere. It's just wherever they have privacy.
There's an interesting thing, and you probably have studied this in law enforcement as well, but I remember these conversations in the military, and then one of our reviewers made the comment that people should consider martial arts. I would have to agree with that comment, because not only do they teach you how to defend yourself, but they teach you situational awareness. And even the comment you made in the beginning talking about social violence, de-escalating and backing out, those are all things that they teach you are the first steps you should be taking with regard to dealing with violent criminals. But something I wanted to mention specifically about weapons, and like a lot of handguns, especially you see a lot of these Glock style weapons where we have to like chamber the round by sliding the top of those barrels on those weapons are slightly angled up inside the mechanism, and a lot of street shooters will hold that weapon sideways to fire at their victim or their person, and that makes the weapon actually quite inaccurate. And the reason why this is valuable for people to know or even to be aware of is that just because the guy gets into a car with you with a gun and says, drive somewhere, and you're going, well, I had to because he had a gun, you're saying, get the heck out of that vehicle, leave. And that's exactly what I would say is that you need to break that immediately, because there's a couple things you need to take into consideration. The probability of him pulling that trigger is relatively low. You have to remember, he's in a parking garage or at a mall or somewhere else where the last thing he wants to do is discharge this weapon and draw attention to himself. So he's not likely to pull the trigger to begin with. Now, let's say he does. You leave the vehicle, he pulls the trigger. What are the odds that he hits you? Now, those numbers go down. And then if he does hit you, what's the chance that he gets you with a kill shot? When you start thinking about all those odds, the chances of you getting hurt by him or killed rather by him is actually relatively low if you fight and flee than if you stay in that vehicle and go where he wants you to go.
Oh, absolutely. Now, if he's the tangible type predator and he gets in your car with a gun and says, get out of this car. I mean, that again, now we're dealing with a tangible predator, and you're like, yeah, I'm out of the car. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But if he gets in the car with a gun and says, drive, now, did he just carjack somebody who's just looking for an escape? Maybe. Like, every situation is different.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're coming out to your car and you get in and, you never saw anybody around and it doesn't look like a violent situation going on, and all of a sudden you get in your car and somebody steps in and says, drive, like you said, they want you to drive somewhere. that's the last thing you want to do is drive out of there. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving legal advice. Every situation is different, but your chances are better of escaping then and there immediately before driving to another location. So, and the odds do go down. And like you mentioned, they're they're not looking to necessarily they don't want to kill you. I mean, that's not their objective, is just to get in a car and kill you. Their objective is something else. And so they might just get out and leave, you know, when it's like, matter of fact, that the story I told you before we went on, that victim, the predator put a gun to her head and he said, "Driver, I'm going to kill you." And she goes, "Well, you might as well kill me then." And she was going to put up a struggle, and he pulled the trigger, and it misfired. I mean, it click, it didn't go off, and she was able to escape. So those situations happened. He was prepared to kill her at that point, just because he had already had enough kills under his belt, where he had more confidence, and it was more of a game to him at that point, because he's looking for that act of violence.
This was the guy in Phoenix that had killed maybe 10 women prior to this.
I believe it was 10 to 12 women total. Yes.
That's incredible.
Wow.
That's
and
incredible.
She was one of the only living victims that was able to get a really good description of this individual that they then put out, because all the other victims were dead.
Can we talk just a little bit about because you talked about two different styles, the blitzing style, and then of course there's the charm, and the charm being more of that type of predator, puts more time, planning, etc. into what they're doing. Of course, there can be the charm thing that are happening where somebody's offering you candy or money, or even one predator that I remember hearing about was the guy walking around with a leash in his hand and saying, "My dog was lost." You mentioned about that. The advantage that the leash gave him in his hand is the minute the person went off somewhere outside of a safe area, they also had a device to strangle them with or whatever. So it was just like, wow. But so the charmer, because I shared with you an experience that I had with a guy who was committing crimes, as it turned out, even murder, but for 10 straight years, nobody knew what this guy was up to. And all of it was around charm, with younger kids and whatnot, but it was all around charm. Is there any advice that you'd give to people, or things to look for? Because in this case, I was working with a guy who was a charmer and a killer. How do you know if you got a charmer in your own neighborhood who might be this character that you're looking for, who's killed 10, 12 women? How do you know?
Well, it's tough, and charm is a learned skill. Like, we're not born to be charming. Just like we're not born to be nice. Those are skills that are developed. So just because somebody is nice or charming does not mean they are a good person. They're just using that as a tool. It's a social tool to develop a relationship. So it's really tough. A lot of times these individuals will drop little statements that just seem a little bit out of sync. Things that they volunteer that you didn't really ask for. Just like you had mentioned, this individual said, "Oh, you know, once in a while we have kids from the neighborhood over, but I don't feel comfortable with that." You know, well, why not? Like, if you're a normal person and maybe you have your own kids, like that would be a normal thing to do. So why would you say that? But it is really tough. I always tell, and I've had family members, actually, a sister that lived next to a person that basically was trying to groom her children. It was pretty apparent that they were doing this, again, to gain access to the children. So always be cautious of somebody that seems real charming, but they're kind of going out of their way to establish relationships with your children. And whether it's a family member, an uncle, a step boyfriend, step husband, or whatever it might be, a stepfather, there's these predators will use women, older women, to gain access to younger children, and the woman is just the means to get access to the children. So you just have to really be cautious, and probably the biggest thing is to not be in denial and put your head into the sand and overlook little idiosyncrasies that are occurring that you just discount. Oh, you discount it away. Why? Because this person's so charming, they're so nice. Like, oh no, they couldn't be capable of that. That's that's basically trying to rationalize away things that your subconscious, your intuition is saying there's something wrong here.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, pets can detect mainly the feelings or the emotions of their pet parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they sense that you're not comfortable, and so the pet will actually be more antagonistic towards the threat, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So if a pet isn't real comfortable around a person, and again, I'm going to say males because usually males are the predators in society. Not always. There's babysitters and nannies that have been involved in things, but predominantly it's males. So if a pet isn't real comfortable with a male subject that is a charmer or a nice person, they're sensing things coming from you that your intuition saying something's not right here, and you're discounting it. You're rationalizing it away and saying, no, it's a really nice person. And I wouldn't accuse them of being a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
And so social, same with women. Like, women have been programmed to be nice, to not be rude to men or other people. Women need to be rude. If somebody is moving in on your space, it's like, back off. You make eye contact with a potential threat, and if a woman isn't comfortable, they need to say, back off, make eye contact, be serious, and that predator will go away. That predator, again, even if it's the predator that's looking for that act of violence, that statement there, they're not using the charm necessarily, or if they are, and you tell them back off, then they'll go away. It's just they need to do that right up front. So.
You know, when you mentioned about being in denial, I shared with you the story of a guy who was actually an employee in a plant that I worked for. I was actually his direct manager. And I think of all the other women in the facility because he was very helpful for everybody there. And their first reaction when they heard some of this news about this character was to say, oh, no, not him. And was to explain all the nice things that he ever did. And so even hearing about the crimes that he was a part of, they were just in total disbelief that it could possibly be him.
Sure, that's your charmer, that's your nice person, and in society, it's hard to know: are they really just a nice, charming person, or are they really masking a second life where they are actually a serial killer, a serial rapist? And you can go back. If you study any of the serial killers and look at Ted Bundy, a perfect example of a charming person that basically used charm to basically entice every one of his victims into a position where then he raped and murdered them. So that's nice does not equal good. Just remember that.
Well, when you mentioned about nice not necessarily being part of our makeup and what we do just normally with people, is that there are things, when you mentioned that, just look for some of these idiosyncrasies or things that just kind of stand out that don't strike you as normal human behavior. I remember years ago actually having a shared driveway, so the person was on the house to the right of where I lived, but I remember that door always just slightly cracking open when I pulled up into the driveway, and I was like, I'm never tempted to always have to know who's coming or going, but it just always struck me as a little bit odd that they wanted to always know. And then one day, squad cars pull up in the driveway, and these guys, they're running a drug outfit out of that place. And I was like, yeah, it just kind of, but I distrusted them because it was obvious their behavior towards me was distrust. And I was like, that's not normal that somebody would want to know that much about me. And so I made sure that I kept them at arm's length, and I wasn't the least bit surprised when the day came that they got hauled away. But I was like, okay, so you are actually looking for somebody. Normal people aren't wondering if the police are coming every time a car pulls into their driveway.
No, so, paying attention is one thing. Opening the door every time to see, is it a customer or is it the cops, isn't normal behavior.
That's exactly right.
Definitely.
Any parting advice you want to give to anybody on this subject of social violence or antisocial violence and predators?
Only that, don't live in fear. You can become where you're paranoid about everything and you're analyzing everything. And there is something to be said to your intuition, where if things don't feel right, then there might be something that's not right. And so trust your gut and really that's probably the best advice I can tell you is trust your intuition, but then know how to react in these situations. You can't just necessarily wait for your intuition to say, hey, we have a situation, and then you don't know how to respond or react to it, because you still got to figure out how to de-escalate or back yourself out of a dangerous situation. And what I would say is basically avoid putting yourself in that situation in the first place. We've touched on social violence. A lot of those events happen where there's drugs and alcohol. So there's a reason people call it a bar fight, and that's because that was a social violent type situation where there was a dominant battle going on. And so avoid those situations where you're putting yourself in those positions. It doesn't mean you have to live a life secluded, but even if, let's say, you do drink and you go out to bars a lot, like, pay attention. If you hear voices being raised somewhere, maybe it doesn't involve you, but let's say that little bar fight goes from fist and bottles into guns and knives. If you see a bar fight developing, don't be one of those that are crowding around like, yeah, let's go, cool, get to see a fight. Just get out of there. Avoid be absent from that situation. So I would say trust your intuition and don't be in denial. There's evil out there. There really is. But it doesn't mean you have to live in fear and not go out and do anything and enjoy life, because that's not a way to live. But just develop safety habits is the best thing I can tell you, and trust your intuition.
And for those dominant males in our viewing audience, it's not a coward that backs down and de-escalates in a situation of violence. It's actually a very smart man that does that, and obviously a smart woman. Get away from those situations that are no good. And what a lot of people say, even in cases where they get involved in the fight, or they said, I really knew better. I shouldn't have been there. I was like, hey, you knew beforehand. Act on that tuition a little earlier rather than later. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody who has joined us here on the broadcast on Instagram, on Twitch TV, Patreon, YouTube, and of course our Facebook pages. Darren Fredrickson, Kevin Hunter, and Kyle Torgerson here on Master Surveillant Mindset. Thanks everybody who joined us. Till next time, take care.